everyone. Welcome to this session on teaching volunteers to teach reading. It is designed for organizations who work with volunteers, and I'm seeing in the list of participants that there are volunteers as well, and I'm hoping that there are takeaways for volunteers as well from the session. My name is Aishwarya. I teach English and Kannada language and literacy to students across ages. I also coach, train, and consult with teachers, teacher leaders, and school leaders. And this year marks the 12th year of my teaching career. And I've spent the majority of these 12 years in under resourced, low income urban schools in India. So let me begin by saying that I began as a volunteer in 2012 in a government school in Bangalore. I was a software engineer at the time, and I'm lucky that my volunteering stint transformed into a rewarding and impactful teaching career. I've also had the privilege to work with a number of volunteers over the years as a teacher and teacher trainer. And in the process, I've got to think through and revise my method of working with volunteers, engaging with volunteers to ensure productive use of time, both for the volunteers and for my students. And that is exactly what I want to share with you today in this session on teaching volunteers to teach reading. The key word definitely here is teaching. I'm not saying helping, recruiting, enabling, facilitating, motivating, inspiring. No, none of that. It is teaching volunteers to teach reading and doing it efficiently with limited resources in a way it works. See, I'm a big fan of not burning out. So, everything I share today is designed keeping in mind that organizations and teachers don't have unlimited bandwidth. In fact, if they did, they would not need volunteers. So, my approach endeavors to maximize volunteer impact while keeping the effort of organizations and teachers minimal and sustainable. I'm definitely not saying no effort, but I'm saying minimal and sustainable effort. So, let's explore context a little bit before we dive into what to do. So I'd like you to consider a typical scenario. Let's look at a typical organization. Consider a school, an after school center, a non-profit founded to provide high quality education. Now, such an organization can get overwhelmed when it encounters literacy gaps and diversity in each classroom or each group of students. See, when your students are unable to read and write at the level they are expected to for their age, much else in quality education becomes unattainable. And I don't have to convince you that literacy is the bare minimum and most crucial prerequisite for everything else we want to change and teach. So, in my experience, at some level, organizations are also under resourced. Sometimes it's the number of teachers, sometimes it is the money, sometimes it's expertise, the ability to teach students who are behind, especially in reading and writing, with or without learning difficulties and disabilities. This is usually when I've seen organizations wonder, what if volunteers could help? So the classroom is too diverse, for example, and the organization might think these 5 students out of 30 are unable to do the basics such as reading and writing. Maybe a volunteer can sit with them and help with that. And fortunately for us, volunteers want to help. See, it is wonderful that volunteers are financially independent, so we don't have to find money to pay them. But this also means that they are often doing this work part-time along with another full-time job elsewhere. Let's remember this bit for later. Volunteers want to make a difference, otherwise why would they donate their time and effort for free? So at some level the cause is calling out to them, and that's very valuable for us. Volunteers come with big ideas and ideals, but lack expertise and teaching know-how, obviously. And of course, these days volunteers are not even restricted by geography. At this point, I'd like to pause and invite you to answer a question. So, volunteers are willing to give us exactly what we want, right? They are willing to give exactly what organizations want, but they're often unsuccessful. That is my claim. I invite you to answer why in the chat. So, in your experience, can you put it in the chat? What comes in the way of volunteer success? And let me wait to read your answers. What comes in the way of volunteer success?
Simi says, what ongoing support and resources can be offered to volunteers after their initial training to help them continue grow as educators? Sindhuja says, a lack of know-how on how to achieve a learning goal in a given period of time. Varun says, lack of resources to learn. Ravi says, time constraint. And Ravi also says what you said earlier, their stress on a full-time job.
For some reason, I can't see the chat, but thank you so much for reading it out, Kavita. So, absolutely, and so much more. So, for all these reasons, volunteers can be unsuccessful. And when a volunteer is unsuccessful, I want to explore a little bit, what is the result when a volunteer is unsuccessful? I'd say the two obvious ones first. The first obvious result is when volunteers don't succeed, it results in minimal or no student outcomes. So you have a bunch of volunteers visiting the students week after week, year after year, but you find the student still struggling to read. The student has not made much progress. And this is, like many of you have already said, because of lack of volunteer expertise. See, once you say it, it's almost obvious. But we cannot forget that volunteers are not from the field of teaching. They have come into teaching from a different field. Maybe in their field they are experts, but not in teaching. The second obvious result is volunteer attrition. See, when a volunteer has come to make a difference, how long can they sustain their motivation when they're unable to make a difference or they're able to make very little difference? I would in fact argue that the better teacher a volunteer is, the faster they will realize that enough progress is not being made and the faster they lose inspiration. In my opinion, though, there are two other more important effects of a failed relationship between volunteers and organizations. That's number 3 and number 4. So, number 3, see, when students, especially those who are already struggling, do not receive high quality, robust teaching, when they don't have a stable support system with all the volunteer attrition, there is a grave impact on their long term outcomes. When a volunteer they love leaves, I've even seen students assume that it's because they are not good enough. I didn't do well enough, I didn't learn fast enough, and my bhaiya or didi left. I've heard that so many times. I always say this. I prefer inaction to inadvertently making a child believe that they cannot learn. And when volunteers don't have teaching know-how, they will have to resort to other peripherals, such as motivating children to learn as their mainstay strategy. And obviously that can neither produce results nor sustain long term. When someone tries something, fourth reason I'd say is when someone tries something and keeps failing at it, what is the likelihood that they'll continue to do it? So we have to remember that these volunteers have full lives outside of the few hours they spend in our organization. And unless there is growth in themselves or their students, why will they stay? And I think this is a huge missed opportunity in recruiting teachers. So many of these volunteers are highly educated with a natural inclination to teach. That's why they've reached out and they have a great potential to become excellent teachers. But when they doubt their own selves or they are disillusioned by the brokenness of the system, we lose potential teachers. So, at the very least, we lose long-term volunteer engagement. So good teachers are already rare to come by. I don't have to tell you that. And we must not lose the ones we find. So, I want to present to you in this session an action plan for volunteer support and therefore the success of the students we serve. And like I said, in as little time and with as little resources as possible. And let me do that with the help of Deepa's story. Deepa is one volunteer. She's actually a 20-year-old BA student from Azim Premji University who had come home for her summer holidays. She received fewer than 10 hours of total training from me. This includes both initial training and follow-up, 10 hours in total. She taught two ninth grade students from a nearby government school near her house. These students were illiterate for all practical purposes. I mean, not even practical, they were illiterate. They were still making errors in their ABCDs. She got to teach them for fewer than 12 hours in total in her engagement. And in that time, this is the result she achieved. Amit, one of the students, showed about 0.4 years of growth, and Manisha, the other student, showed 0.8 years of growth. And this is in fewer than 12 hours. That's around 2.5 calendar weeks, assuming they met for less than an hour every weekday. Of course, I'm amazed by these numbers, but what I was very aware of throughout my interaction with Deepa was that this was her first introduction to teaching. She's so young and just still studying. And I must not do anything to spoil her interest in it. That was also one of my goals when I was working with her. So I'm happy to report that this is what she said when I met her for a final reflection meeting before she went back to Azim Premji. And she's really interested to figure out if teaching is a career choice for her at this moment. And it's a very informed statement also. If I can support myself, then I'll definitely want to do it. So from my experience of teaching Deepa and many other volunteers, here's a 5-step action plan for volunteer support. This is what I do. I've done it time and again. Number 1, restructure resources in the organization. Number 2, welcome volunteers with intentionality. Number 3, match students. Number 4, provide initial training. Many organizations do that. And number 5, provide ongoing support. So let's look at each of them one by one. So number 1, restructure resources. To train and support volunteers. First of all, I encourage organizations to look at what resources are currently going into their volunteer support and restructure those resources. Here are a few things that are crucial. Who is responsible for supporting volunteers in your organization? Can you name them? Is there time in this person's, or if there are many people, in these people's weekly timetable to do this work? Or is it just one more thing that's on their plate with no time in the calendar? How much of your resources are going into finding and getting volunteers versus how much of your resources are going into supporting volunteers? My radical suggestion is to spend little time on finding volunteers and a large percentage of time on the select few volunteers that you have got and work with them in such a way that they stay with you long term, so that there is a return of investment for you on your time. So I encourage you to look at it from this perspective. If one person in your organization is working with 3 volunteers, let's say each volunteer is working with 6 students each. You apply the numbers that I showed for Deepa. Think about how many years of cumulative growth students can experience in 3 to 4 months even. So I'm not saying recruit more staff in your organization. I'm saying restructure. If closing reading gaps and utilizing volunteers for the same is your top priority for the year, I highly encourage you to make a list of everything that your staff is doing right now that has less priority than this and remove something and make place for this. This is in fact also a low stakes opportunity for your experienced teachers to try their hand at teacher training and develop themselves beyond the confines of their own classroom. And lastly, in terms of resource restructuring, the most important point to consider in this arrangement is this will fail if this person who is in charge of the volunteers is only a manager with no experience in teaching the same subject to similar students in similar contexts. It is absolutely okay if they don't have experience and failure and success in this area. The easiest thing to do right away is for them to teach alongside. Otherwise, the support will just be logistical support and the suggestions will be, suggestions in the air, and this will not be transfer of teaching learning know-how. It will just be management. Let me go to the second step. Welcome volunteers with intentionality and efficiency. So, see, with volunteers, unlike teachers, most often there is no recruitment process. You get who you get. And like I said, we don't have unlimited time and resources to get to know them. But getting to know certain basic information about them is crucial for this relationship to succeed. So I use a very short volunteer questionnaire for this. And I always do this over a conversation and not over a Google form, because a conversation allows for follow-up questions. So I'm looking to understand 4 things, and I'll take you through those 4 things. Number 1, what is their purpose? Why are they here? What moved them? Usually something that the volunteer has seen or experienced has brought them to this moment, and I want to know what that is, so that I'll know whether the actual work I'm giving them is even related to that experience or not, and even what their future plans are. Do they want to get involved in education in any shape or form in future? Number 2, what are their strengths? Very simple. I am looking for what is their educational background, what subjects they are best at, and is there any subject they have already taught someone, even as simple as helping a younger sibling 5 years ago with math, or helped a neighbor with their science project. I want to know what subjects come easily to them. Recently, a BSc math student from a very good university traveled all the way from Chennai to Mysore, where I live, to volunteer at a low income school. And she was just assigned to teach English because the principal felt that she spoke good English. And also, the school felt like that's what they need for their students. Actually, they didn't even ask her what she's studying and what she's good at. See, English is always going to be a primary need or urgent need, especially in tier 1 and tier 2, tier 2 and tier 3 cities in rural areas. And in this case, it was a huge missed opportunity again, because she was absolutely clueless in teaching English. She was as clueless as she was enthusiastic about math. She did a below average job at best, but she could have actually made a difference with math. So knowing what they do is crucial. What they know and what they like, what comes easily to them is crucial. Number 3, I talk about logistics. I want to know what their week looks like. They are saying that they are able to give you 2 hours, 3 hours. Is it actually 2 hours, 3 hours? Or is it actually half an hour or 45 minutes? How far do they live from school? If school is the place they're supposed to visit, what is their mode of travel? See, I know that the school itself has a timetable and it's extremely difficult to accommodate everyone and everything. But usually I get this info from them at the beginning itself, because I know that a school calendar and timetable will change. Something is going to go wrong. Some teacher is going to quit in the middle of the year. There will be crisis. And at that time, I want to be as considerate and accommodating as possible to the volunteers' schedule. Timetabling and scheduling is a beast in itself. I experience it every day, but I feel like it's a beast that can be tamed. And I try very hard to ensure that that doesn't come in the way of the relationship working. Lastly, I figure out what their time commitment is. See, in my experience, the weekly or monthly time commitment is the most misleading piece of data that goes out to volunteers from the organization's side. It's one of the most misunderstood things, not just for volunteers, I think for teachers also. You might meet a class for 1 hour a week, but in order for that class to work at all, some time needs to be spent before the class and some time needs to be spent after the class. Very rarely, after multiple years of experience, and when the teacher knows his students very well, maybe they'll be able to go into class without much preparation or what appears like very little preparation or no preparation and kill it. I'm not saying exorbitant amounts of time, but if volunteer spends no time before and after class, I don't see how the result can be a good class. So setting this expectation right is extremely important in the beginning itself. Because if somebody says, I have 2 hours a week to give your organization, it is worth thinking about whether they must spend both those hours teaching or perhaps 1 hour teaching and 1 hour in preparation and follow up. So it's also useful to know how long they are planning to volunteer so that you can set realistic goals for your students to achieve in that time available. And all of this data I collect so that I can try to honor their boundaries and leverage their strengths. See, whether it's volunteers or teachers, not respecting their boundaries and getting them to stretch beyond their reasonable capacity will probably work in the short term. It cannot sustain long term. So, volunteers have a complete life and job without this. So, if it gets too much, they're going to leave. So, my time investment for this for this meeting to welcome them is usually 20 to 30 minutes, not more than that. Let me go to the third point, which is match students. Now, like I mentioned in the BSc example, it is essential to take a call on how many students should be assigned to this volunteer to begin with, what subject they must teach, and whether there are other things to consider before matching a volunteer with a student. Number 4, this is where I want to spend the most time on, apart from ongoing support, it's initial training. Now, with initial training, I try to spend about 4 to 5 hours with the volunteer. That's my rule of thumb. There's not, usually that itself is a stretch. You don't get 4 to 5 hours to train the volunteers initially, but I aim for that. And in that time, I'm usually looking to give out relevant information about the students that they're going to work with, basics of the subject they're going to teach, essential principles of teaching and learning, and give them resources that they are going to use. Now, in this initial training, about 80% of the material for me remains the same. I don't do it each time, or my slides, my materials remain the same. Roughly 20% usually specific to the volunteer and specific to the students and their struggle or needs at the moment. Also, 20% is dependent on how overwhelmed the volunteer is with the information that I'm giving them in initial training, because sometimes it's better to give a piece of information in initial training. Sometimes it's better taken care of later. Let them get started, and when the time is right, you can give some information to them. So in such a case, I make note of what I must make sure I cover later and complete the training. Now, this is possible only if the organization is able to provide ongoing support later. Okay. Anyway, so I'll share my checklist for my initial training. There are 8 things in my checklist. Starting with the basics of the subject. See, just because somebody can read and write English doesn't mean they can teach reading and writing. So because my subject is reading and writing, I have a standard introduction to the subject. And in case of English, I have a standard introduction to the English writing system. Why are spellings the way they are? What is the first step to be taught? What comes later? What comes after that? These are the basics that anyone attempting to teach this language should know. Of course, you can't teach the volunteer everything, even inside of the basics, but it's extremely basic what I cover here. And I make it very clear that in those 5 hours that this is just basics. Here's what you don't know also. And here's like the initial step you can take once you are comfortable with these basics. Here's what you can do. Look at this resource, ask this question to me, write back to me. So I always make sure that I leave that door open to them. It's essential in two ways. They have to know that they don't know everything that they have to know. Nobody knows everything that there is to know, right? As a trainer, I don't either. But they know very little. And I make sure they know that, while telling them that once you're comfortable with this much, here's your next step and here's how you take it. I also cover why these students have fallen behind. I give them a very basic overview of learning difficulties, disabilities, other issues like family problems, which can come in the way of a student's success at school. Second, I provide them student information. This is specific to the students that they will be working with. This is any information that will increase the probability of their relationship with the child working out. And also, I think about, so for example, assume that this student has dyslexia, or you have a question about whether this particular student has dyslexia. Ideally, they should be going to a specialist. You shouldn't be sending them to a volunteer, but things are however they are. Usually, I tell volunteers this. First, make sure that whatever you've taught first is 100% known to the student. They're able to tell you what they've learned 100%. They know what you've taught and they're able to do what they need to do before you go to the next topic. That's usually not what happens in a conventional classroom, because you have children in a different setup. That's something that I push for. But with a child with dyslexia, for example, let's say he's getting confused between B and D, small letter B and D. If the volunteer applies this piece of advice, I'll not go ahead with other letters until this child learns the difference between B and D. It's going to be disastrous, because that's probably going to be a lifelong difficulty for this child. In that case, the volunteer has to know to let go and move on. So that kind of information is very crucial for the volunteer. And when the organization has such information, it's necessary to pass it on to the volunteer. Even, what is the starting point? Where do you begin with this student? And understanding where exactly the student is and what is the next best step for the student in their learning journey. Figuring that out is actually an advanced teaching skill. One can't expect somebody with absolutely no teaching know-how to be able to do that. So they end up either pitching the class too low or pitching it too high. And it's a bad start, right? And it's very difficult to fix bad starts. So giving them the exact starting point is also very, very useful. Number 3, code of conduct and policy. I don't want to go into detail about this, but very basic, no physical punishment, policy on rewards, etc. It's extremely essential for us to keep our students safe. So I'm just putting it out there that I take care of this. I won't go into detail. Resources. Somebody brought this up in the initial chat also. So with Deepa, for example, I gave her these 2 books. I always suggest that we give already available progressions and resources to volunteers and not reinvent the wheel. It's a lot of time and effort goes into reinventing the wheel to figure out lesson plans, to figure out progressions. And at the end of the day, volunteer is not figuring it out. Somebody else is figuring it out. That person is not meeting the children. Hence, I don't spend time on that. I also don't use resources that I will use when I teach somebody reading from scratch. I'm looking for resources that are easily executable by the volunteer. This resource, for example, is something that I shared with Deepa. I like this. I like the progression. I like the words that the author has used to introduce reading. I like the order in which it is presented. But there's an issue with this book. And that is, this author sort of breaks the word up in a way that is unproductive for later. For example, I don't know if this is relevant to all of you, I'll try to explain this very quickly. For example, if you follow this book exactly the way it asks you to teach, you have to teach SIT sit like this. S, E, C. C, sit. This is how the book asks you to teach. I have an issue with this because when the word sight comes, you don't want the sight comes, you don't want the child to go S, E, C. C, seat, C, E. You don't want that to happen, right? I can represent E. I can also represent I, depending on the situation in the word. So what I told the volunteer was this: don't do this breakup. I like the words, I like the order in which it is presented, but don't use that part. These kind of edits are easier to make than building something from scratch. When I make these kind of edits, I also have the opportunity to explain it to the volunteers. So I'm also, training them to understand basics of teaching reading, what can go wrong, and how I am analyzing the situation, and they get to learn a lot through this process itself. And then I make sure that I give the volunteers extremely short-term goals. I don't do unit plans, year plans, trimester plans like the ones we do with teachers. The goals are so short-term that they are like this. Identify capital letters in order is one goal. Identifying capital letters out of order is one goal. Writing capital letters in order is one goal. Dictation of those capital letters out of order is one goal. So these 4 goals I might present to the volunteer together and again break it down and say, you take the first one, work on it. Once you're done with this, tell me and let's move to the next goal. Assuming that this is the starting point for the student the volunteer is working with. Again, this ensures multiple things. This ensures that the students are left 1 hour better because you're working on very, very small things at a time. Even in the case where the volunteer just leaves after 1 week, maybe my child who did not know A to Z now knows A to Z. And that's important for me to make sure that every hour is in that direction of 1 hour better and not having an extremely long-term goal none of which gets implemented in the time we have the volunteer. Also, this allows me to understand the struggles of the volunteer and sort of observe them and catch issues and help them resolve those issues before it becomes too late, and also train them in the process. Next thing is I provide the structure for the class. So I'm seeing there are many organizations which put a lot of effort in creating lesson plans for volunteers. Kudos to them. At least in my experience, lesson plans have not worked. Lesson plans are disguised time limits. You have to complete 1 lesson in a day, and after this lesson, you have to move on to the next lesson. It sort of mimics what happens in their general classroom. Okay, and so then there is very little difference between the context in which the child has failed and this new context. The lessons might be different, but the same thing gets repeated. So I need my volunteers to be thinking people. Only if they think can the child in front of them learn. They cannot have their brains off while working with children. Also, they should not focus on completing the lesson or following the steps in the lesson. They should focus on the goal, the content, and the child. That is the crux of good teaching. If you're able to focus on the content and the child and respond to the child in front of you, that is training for becoming a good teacher. So instead of a lesson plan, I provide the structure for a class. And this is a flexible structure with a rough duration advice and components. I'll show you. This, for example, is a photograph of Deepa's class. So I tell her that your class should have 5 components. One is retrieval practice, about 5 minutes. You have to, and I tell her how to conduct the retrieval practice, not just yesterday's lesson or yesterday's knowledge that you have to question them on. One question from yesterday, maybe one question from previous week, one question from last month. So I give her a very easy structure so that she'll do this. See, a volunteer, by the time they realize that they must keep on revising whatever you've done earlier, it will be too late. So giving this sort of short circuits the process. Then I had told her to do a reading lesson of the day, then some reading practice with the students. This reading practice comes from the book that I showed you earlier, Dolores Hiskey's Reading Pathways and Phonics Pathways. Then there is a dictation. I tell her how to choose dictation words from phonics pathways. Then there is a read aloud, and I give her a bunch of read aloud books and sources for read aloud books and encourage her to choose inside of that. So you see, inside of every component, there is flexibility and there are no time limits. Okay, however long it takes to complete a lesson, she has to take that much time to complete the lesson. Many times she'd do it earlier than I thought. Many times she'd take longer than I thought because she is in front of the children. I am not. Number 7 is I give them pre-test and post-test tools. These are not assessments that I have designed or I don't let the volunteers design. I mean, they can design assessments for their class at some point, but these are the tools that I use for measurement. Before the volunteer starts and when they leave, I ensure that there is a pre-test and a post-test done. It's extremely helpful for them as well as for us to know if there has been any impact at all and what kind of impact there has been. So I use something like this. This is the Shonell reading level test. Very simple, quick to administer, easy test that is available freely online. I teach the volunteers how to execute it, how to conduct themselves with the students while executing this test, and how to record the data so that we can also use it later for progress monitoring. I'll get to that in the next section. Lastly, I teach them some essential principles of teaching and learning, just enough for them to understand that learning to teach is a long-term process. Because many volunteers come with pre-made decisions, such as I want my class to be fun, and they're spending hours and hours on Google trying to find the most innovative lesson. Whereas I want them to find the shortest path to teach the child something. We don't have the time for elaborate activities which may or may not result in learning. We need guarantees. And their instinct for new teachers and volunteers is to ascribe student failure to lack of motivation. And they then go on into this space of finding ways to motivate the student and go into rabbit holes in that direction. Instead, I want them to figure out what aspects of teaching and learning is not working and work on them to make it better. Parts of this I do cover in initial training. This is my checklist. And lastly, I want to talk very quickly about ongoing support. Instead of delegate and forget, it rarely works with somebody who's so new to teaching and learning. So I do 6 things in my ongoing support. One is observe. So usually teacher observations are like you're the teacher coordinator, sit through the entire class, figure out the key piece that will change this teacher's teaching and then give them feedback on that, etc., etc. I don't do that much. See, like I said in the previous slides, I have 5 components in the class. I will pick one component of that class and observe only that part. And it's very difficult for me to get to their class when that component is beginning, observe, get out, etc., and figure out my day. So I do audio observations, not video. Video is very difficult, resource intensive for me. I do audio observations. So they have to just go to their WhatsApp, start recording the class when that section starts, stop recording when that section stops, and just send it to me. I can listen to it whenever, wherever, even when I'm taking a walk. Just by hearing what is happening in the class, I understand what I can speak to the volunteers when I meet them. And I suggest you meet often. Once in 10 days is minimum. I feel like 3 times a month is good. When I meet them, I ask them their top of mind questions, thoughts, etc. I also teach them one aspect of teaching and learning based on the questions they have or the observations that I've made from that audio recording. I think a key component of ensuring that teachers succeed and get better in their work is to make sure that they have somebody who they can regularly talk to. Somebody with slightly more experience than them, somebody who has struggled with what they're struggling right now and overcome it. That itself can be the big difference between good teaching and bad teaching. Give that opportunity to the volunteers as often as reasonably possible. Celebrate their wins each time they make progress. Only when they are motivated, they can go back and motivate their students. Troubleshoot with them. They are going to hit brick walls. I mean, there's no way out. Whether you're a volunteer teacher, teaching your own child at home, you're going to hit brick walls. So, leaving them alone when they hit brick walls is a recipe for volunteer attrition. So, I troubleshoot problems with them and also unburden them from non teaching tasks. For example, with Deepa, we figured that even that book, which is actually meant for very young children, the word or the progression of the words, it's actually meant for very young children, but these ninth graders were struggling even with that. So I quickly realized that this is the same problem that I've encountered with countless other children that I have taught. I had created a resource for my children when they struggle with that kind of word order, with some changes in word order, when you're struggling with short vowels. I immediately sent this resource to Deepa, and in 2 days, the struggle was no longer present. It was just fixed. I reached this resource after 10, 12 years of my teaching. A volunteer is not going to be able to do that. So we can short circuit that time for them and help our students in turn. And just like I said, pre-test and post-test, I use similar tools for progress monitoring so that, again, time to time, first of all, you know whether this program is working or not, or it's a giant waste of time and something needs to change. Secondly, if things are going well, you get an opportunity to celebrate. And that is your intrinsic motivation, that builds your motivation to work harder. And you need doses of inspiration regularly in order to keep your work going. Lastly, I create spaces for reflection by giving them reflection tools or asking them questions that allow them to reflect when I meet them. This, I think, is the biggest gift you can give a new teacher. Make them independent in figuring out how to observe themselves, how to be aware of themselves in the class, after class, figure out what is that one thing that made this class go well, what is that one point after which this class became a disaster. If they're able to do that root cause analysis on themselves, on their own, and then give them tools to sort of understand what the brick wall is, be able to articulate what their brick wall is, and then figure out how to overcome it. I think this is the biggest gift you can give any new teacher. And just this process can fill them with so much purpose that they'll want to stay. So, using this 5-step action plan, when I taught Deepa, she was able to teach Amit and Manisha and not just give me these numbers. We were also able to figure out that Amit might be dyslexic and tell his school, inform his school that they must investigate further. We didn't label him that, but we did see a lot of signs of dyslexia and we were able to figure that out. So if he gets tested, if they investigate further and if he gets tested, he might actually get a writer, perhaps even a reader for his 10th board exams. This could mean the difference between him failing and passing in the 10th board exam. So I think this is a good job done by Deepa, along with a lot of other reflections and takeaways that she's shared with me. So lastly, I want to tell you that, of course, we have responsibility towards our students. We need to provide the best opportunity for their learning. We need to try our hardest not to kill their self-belief through a bad volunteering system. And we need to aim for a system which makes them 1 hour better, even amidst chaos and volunteer turnover. And we also have a responsibility towards volunteers to support them so they experience the joy of teaching amidst its highs and lows, they might not choose to continue, but I want to give the best shot to retain them and nurture their love for teaching so that, I increase that likelihood that they'll stay, like I just said. Now, I shared few resources throughout this presentation: basic knowledge, skills to teach beginning reading, resources and progressions that I use, questionnaire for volunteer recruitment, my pre and post test tools, my weekly support meeting template, a flexible template, it's not rigid at all, or this presentation itself. If you would like any of these resources, or if you would like to work with me to build a system for your organization, please reach out to me, write to me at teachingtenets@gmail.com.